All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Carrie Matwick. I'm a senior lecturer at NTU and coordinator of the NTU Food Studies Research Cluster. It is a pleasure to introduce you today's speaker, Jenny Dorsey, a chef, author, and researcher whose work explores the connections between food, identity, and society. Jenny is currently a Fulbright National Geographic Scholar and is studying hawker centers in Singapore. She's a James Beard Award nominated writer. Her work has appeared in numerous locations such as the Washington Post, The Eater, Food and Wine, and she was named to Food and Wine's Industry Changemakers list. So today we're delighted she'll be talking about the politics of food, which will explore how food shapes our identities, influences social structures, and reinforces power dynamics. So she'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes Q&A. So we encourage you to engage with her insights and ask questions at the end of the presentation. Again, the event is proudly sponsored by the NTU Food Studies. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Dorsey.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the intro, Carrie, and thank you all for having me. As she mentioned, I am American, actually, but I am currently in Singapore studying hawker centers. So there will be a portion towards the end of this presentation where I'll be applying some of the principles and themes that we've explored, specifically in the context of hawker centers. And just as a quick background, before I kind of transitioned into nonprofits and academia, I cooked in various Michelin-starred restaurants in New York City and San Francisco and ran a food events business. So I've seen kind of interesting, I guess, the dichotomy like academia, food studies, as well as like on the ground people making food. And so I'll discuss a little bit more about that dynamic later on as well. So I'm always nervous to talk about this subject because it is like my favorite subject in the entire world. And I have been given some feedback that I tend to get really excited and talk really fast or drone on and on. So I'll try to rein all of those in today and talk at an even cadence and present all the thoughts I would like in a nice and orderly way. So I'm going to try my best to not give so many examples, but there will be tons of examples, and especially during the Q&A, happy to supply many more. There's always more where that came from. So the lecture today is called The Politics of Food because there is one big question that I hope everyone will feel equipped to answer after this hour, and that is how and why is food political? So while food is commonly characterized just as a means of sustenance and eating or like a lovely time to have together, in reality, the ways in which we grow, distribute, and acquire what we eat, and then how and when and why and with whom we eat or don't, underpin some of the most basic structures in our society. It is an incredibly significant, if not the most significant, driver of shifts of human behavior because our relationship with food fundamentally shapes who we believe ourselves to be and how we should act in relation to other people. So how does it do that? I would like to start with a personal example. So Carrie, if you'll go to the next slide. So why is food political to me? Well, my very existence in the food industry is incredibly political. I am a first generation Chinese American chef. My friend Davina and I were the only two women in our culinary class. You can see her on the left side. And she was out openly at the time, and I was not. So every day we were, by design, unwinding some very political threads within the food industry, even though we didn't really have the vocabulary to quite describe that. So this included everything from physically contorting our bodies to fit the kitchen counters that were constructed against a standard of like a 5'8" or 172 cm person. That was the average height of a man at the time countertops were standardized. And obviously, well, I guess not obvious from the photo because you can't tell proportions, but both of us, I assure you, are not 5'8" or 172 cm. And we were also negotiating the types of internships we were being offered as cute women. So namely, we were always told to be hostesses or maybe servers in dresses that could be kind of displayed to customers instead of being offered positions to be cooking in the kitchen. Being Chinese and being in culinary school, that was a kind of more French focused, European focused school, I was curious to see how Chinese food would be represented by the school. It is considered a decently prestigious one in New York City. So after spending 2 months studying the intricacies of French cuisine, all the way down to which side of the Rhone River a cow has grazed on to produce certain cheese, I remember we spent just 2 days learning Chinese cuisine that didn't even differentiate between regions or what Chinese versus Chinese American, or here in Singapore, Chinese diasporan food tasted like. I felt ashamed and embarrassed by how my instructors spoke of the foods that I loved and held in high esteem, dismissing them as simplistic, greasy, or lacking in what they considered real technique. One particular memory that always stood out to me is my chef instructor adding an entire bottle of ketchup to a sweet and sour sauce that I was concocting, effectively overpowering the version I was making, which uses rock sugar for the sweetness and black vinegar for the sourness. So there are near infinite varieties of sweet and sour in Chinese cuisine, but the man, he felt so entirely confident as he looked me in the eye and said, all the Chinese cooks I know use ketchup. So years later, I reflected upon what it means to be Chinese and American in this piece that you see on the right here called Model Minority. It's the fourth dish of a pop-up called Asian in America that I toured across the United States during 2018, 2020. It was part of a dinner series with 6 courses of food, 3 courses of cocktails that was paired with virtual reality, poetry, and spoken word. So I really wanted to challenge the idea that thesis statements need to be in some sort of long form or written format to be valid. I saw this dish as an edible thesis of what it means to use food to reclaim my own identity, determine who my community was, and grapple with the kind of responsibility that comes with any level of privilege in our current society. So I don't want to get into the weeds with this dish. We have a lot more to go through, but I'll touch upon a few symbolic parts. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the maize on the outside. That's a puree made from chrysanthemum grains. It represents the complexity of navigating identity as an immigrant and a woman of color, while the use of chrysanthemum comments on the kind of flattening narrative of discovery that brought the vegetable into the American mainstream. So at the time of the dish's debut in 2018, chrysanthemum grains or tonghao, flooded menus in New York cities because several white male chefs had proclaimed it to be the hot new thing, the cool new vegetable, even though, of course, it had already been long available and readily eaten in communities that they were simply not part of. The main protein of this dish is veal sweetbreads. Sweetbreads, if you're not familiar, are the thymus glands of baby veal. So it's one of the few organ meats that doesn't usually seem to carry this stigma of being cheap or unappetizing. On the contrary, it's often actually seen as luxurious. It's often served in fine dining restaurants, but almost always in the same manner. It's deep fried and usually found in a thick gravy. So I found that to be an apt parallel to the Asian American experience of being the quote unquote model minority, to be given special treatment as the good minority and pitted against the bad minorities, but at the cost of having to acquiesce to what those in power wanted of us, for us to shut up, sit down, and stay in line. And finally, this rice gel sheet on top is purposely made to have the texture similar to classic rice rolls or chongfen, as many of you are probably familiar with. While it's well loved in Singapore and pretty common to find, this is a texture that's often referred to as slimy or sticky in the Western food canon. And I used it to envelop everything underneath, so you can't really see the sweetbreads, as a way of capturing this tension that no matter how I contort myself to fit into the ideals of others, and even if I'm eventually able to reach the center of the mythical maze of acceptance in some context of America, I can never escape the fact that in countless other contexts, I will always be seen with all the preconceived notions of what I look like that will subliminally and yet undoubtedly inform how I move through the world. So I serve this dish alongside a virtual reality visual that contained the last few lines of a longer accompanying poem. Next slide. So here's the last couple lines. In the end, being Asian American is a maze, a question about a hyphen, a contradiction, all bound tightly together in a feeling of growing up somewhere but never belonging. So now that you all know why I really care about this topic, let's talk about why you should also care to understand why food is political. The real meat, pun intended, of my work is examining how the politics of food constructs our individual, social, and political identities, and how that ultimately goes on to impact our relationships and our lives. So how does food do this exactly? So number one, food has long been a weapon to create these in versus out groups, you versus me, us versus them. Some of the most avid laws created by colonizers in the Americas were on what white settlers could or could not eat. So just consider this common saying in colonial Venezuela: cassava isn't bread and Indians aren't people. See, food was not a trite matter, but an extension and a definition of someone's humanity. So on the left, you can see when the Spanish landed in what is now Latin America, they observed that the indigenous men did not have beards, unlike them. And it was subsequently believed that eating native foods to the area would cause their men to lose their beards, which were an essential sign of masculinity at the time and very much tied to someone's social standing. So that's why, for our infamous discoverer, Christopher Columbus, ensuring a steady import of Spanish foods to the Americas was not just an issue of dietary preference, but of moral significance. This thinking worked in the inverse as well. So when certain European foodstuffs like wheat and coffee were imported and then found to grow well in what was then Hispaniola, it was interpreted as a divine sign that colonialism was approved of by the gods. Across the world in colonial India, the British employed a very similar tactic. They noticed that the locals ate far more rice and lentils than the wheat-based British diet, and conveniently used their powers to declare a widespread crisis of caloric malnutrition. The solution to the crisis, of course, was to keep British authorities in charge of public infrastructure, such as the markets in India, the social services being provided, and framing it as a benevolent act of maintaining public welfare for Indian subjects. So as you can see, food has long anchored how we make meaning of the world. And especially for those in power, food is an essential tool for purposely interpreting existing circumstances to benefit themselves and their community, often through the exclusion of others. Next slide. So I do want to be clear that using food to draw boundaries between people is not some relic of the past. I know I just gave a lot of historical examples. These tactics especially tend to show up in times of fear and confusion all the way to the modern day, when we're looking for someone or someone's to blame in a crisis. So if you consider the video of a Chinese person eating bat soup that went viral at the start of COVID-19 in 2020, even though its relationship to coronavirus was quickly debunked, it was found the video had been filmed years before COVID even happened. It provided a really tidy narrative for American news outlets and social commentators to connect the dangerous Asian diet with the unwanted influence of dangerous Asian people at the height of pandemic fears. And the results speak for themselves. In 2021, hate crimes against Asian Americans had risen 342% in certain areas compared to the year prior. Next slide. So number two, controlling the food supply is the ultimate mechanism for controlling people because food offers a direct access to power. So let's start with babies. They are the definition of entirely powerless and dependent. In the early days, babies need a particular set of nutrients to survive and grow up healthy. And although research has found that breast milk is the best option for new babies, many babies end up becoming formula babies, myself included. A significant contributing factor to why is that the baby formula industry has been long lobbying against paid maternity leave, even as they run these nice marketing campaigns professing their care for infant development. To sustain and grow demand for their product, the industry has purposely limited the supply of breast milk available for new babies by ensuring that their mothers can't stay at home and take care of them. Unfortunately, this kind of forced dependency is the standard playbook rather than the exception. Going back in time again, in the 1800s, the American military and hired hunters were encouraged to kill every bison they could across the Great Plains because the indigenous populations of the area were heavily reliant on the animal as a source of food and materials. In just 20 years, the hunter managed to nearly exterminate the North American bison. You can see all of those bison heads in that photo there, which is wild. The population went from about 8 million to fewer than 500. It's like a lot of bison to kill. So even today, this event is considered by scientists as a ecological catastrophe, but it did indeed force native populations to to submit to settler rule. So indigenous nations of the area were resettled onto reservations far away from their native lands, cut off from ancestral foods, and then made to be highly dependent on processed rations that were given to them, like white sugar, flour, and coffee, that continue to cause pretty adverse health impacts in indigenous communities. So now you might be wondering what happens to communities that do find ways to operate independently and avoid outside interference. So in the case of Malaysia and Singapore, there's a great sociologist named Said Hussein Alatas that has showcased how there's this prevailing quote unquote myth of the lazy native that was used to characterize indigenous Malays as slow and backward, in large part because they had socioeconomic structures that allowed them to exist outside of colonial rule. So compare this to Chinese immigrants who are often portrayed as entrepreneurial or productive because they were present as merchants, intermediaries, servants who had to interface with, or were at least in some part dependent on the colonial government. The Malay indigenous people could exist autonomously. So to justify the exploitation and forced servitude and eventual land dispossession of the indigenous peoples, the colonial government needed to construct an identity of natives as people who were inherently unwilling to work or morally suspect, and thus in need of some heavy-handed control. Next slide. So 3, our relationship with food structures our approach to social and economic problems, so much so that it can actually fundamentally change what we believe the problem we're trying to solve actually is. The uncomfortable truth is that for a long time now, years and years, we have been producing, growing enough food to feed the entire world 1.5 times over. And yet, it doesn't seem like that because we obviously have millions and millions of hungry people because there are deep infrastructural inequalities from centuries of colonialism, military domination, financial imperialism, poorly regulated capitalism, to name just a few, many social ills of our time. So this is a very tricky problem for world leaders who claim that they want to fight global hunger, but their own countries benefit from existing power imbalances. So it's necessary to wholesale kind of reframe the problem into something that's going to be much more straightforward. And that's why we have something called the calorie deficit. So a little quick history and science lesson. It won't be very long, I promise. The concept of a calorie was coined by this chemist, Wilbur Atwater, in the 1890s as a standardized unit of energy that's found in all food. So on the left here, you can see a photo of one of his test subjects in this respiratory calorimeter, which measures calories. I can go into that for a while, but I'll just leave it at that. While the calorie was an important step for nutritional science, its creation did turn a variety of foods into these interchangeable widgets. So as a result, hunger could become a very simple equation of supplying enough calories through whatever foods are available to calorie deficient people. So for countries that had taken this noble task of solving hunger, food relief or caloric fulfillment can now take the form of any caloric foods that they mandated as aid. So pictured here in the middle is one from the US known as corn soy blend, or CSB, which is made from corn and soy, and it tastes like ash cardboard. So why would this particular food be chosen as international aid? Well, it just so happens that the US produces a massive glut of corn and soy every year. So, under the guise of charity, the Department of Agriculture can actually create new markets for American agribusinesses in countries that have little ability to say no. And so once the free hunger relief that has flooded into these countries and has put local food producers out of business, lo and behold, another country now depends on imported food instead of homegrown food. You may think all of this agricultural dumping, which is what it's called, would have at least eased global hunger, but that has not at all been the case for decades. So, in the face of questionable numbers, basically increasing amounts of hungry people, despite all these millions of dollars of charitable aid, the calorie is also a very flexible unit of measure that can be adjusted to create success overnight. How so? You simply reduce the caloric threshold of what each person must consume to be qualified as malnourished. And suddenly, a dramatic number of people can officially be calculated, by census or stats as no longer hungry. So it looks like a miracle on paper, even if nothing on the ground has actually happened. The point is, how a problem is structured is implicitly limiting how and what solutions are considered. And so this is something that social sciences professor Julie Guthman calls problem closure. So for a closer to home example, most Singaporeans here have probably eaten a less than delicious tomato. Even the expensive ones from little farms, I have splurged on them. They are not very good. And that's because tomatoes are a very finicky fruit. And our existing food supply chain does not set it up for success. So it's not Singapore's fault. It's the tomatoes' fault. Besides being picked hard and green and gassed with ethylene to become red, many tomatoes actually never can ripen to contain all the subtle flavor chemicals that make up a good tasting tomato. It also turns very mealy, as you've probably experienced, if stored at the wrong temperature for just a few days. And it doesn't help that refrigerated trucks are held at a certain temperature, but the cargo ships another temperature, our refrigerators another temperature, etc. So, how do we solve this? Well, big agribusinesses like Monsanto have approached the problem as one of fixing the tomato. Their scientists are at work genetically modifying the tomato to withstand the current shipping environment rather than changing the supply chain, which has, at least so far, generally benefited them. So, this idea that more technology, more human intervention, more private control are the solutions is now such a standard mindset, we don't really question it too much. And that's kind of the point. Food has helped our thinking become society's kind of accepted default setting. Next slide. So I hope these examples make it clear that food is anything but ordinary or passive or inconsequential. Food serves a profoundly philosophical purpose across every human context it is involved. And it has and continues to organize our social hierarchies, inform the development and enforcement of our laws, and frame the design of our social, economic, and political systems. Food shapes our identities by telling us what version of ourselves is right, how and where we belong in the world, and what perspective to take when looking within and at one another. And so that really changes everything. At this point, you might ask, if food politics is so meaningful, hopefully you're like, you sold me, I get it. But why is it so invisible to most of us? So this is a great question, and I assure you, I think about it all the time. I vent about it to all my friends. Why don't people talk about this more? So what I've observed personally, in what has now been over a decade of professionally listening to people opine about food, is that the duality of food makes it quite difficult for people to hold two truths simultaneously. On one hand, food can be and indeed is a vehicle or a tool or a platform to build bridges across differences. In fact, there's some research that has found our bodies do generate higher levels of oxytocin. This is the same chemical that's released by breastfeeding moms to stimulate bonding with the baby after sharing a meal with other people. So the impact of sharing a meal, breaking bread together is not just imagined. But on the other hand, the waterfall of examples I've just offered shows how food can also be a source of great injustice in our world. These unpleasant truths are not just hard to hear, they often incriminate us in some way. So I, for one, I'm well aware of the horrors that Chiquita has committed in Latin America and Dole in Hawaii. And yet, on most any random weekday, you can find me buying a banana or maybe a pineapple from cold storage because it's convenient and it's on my way home from the MRT. So the tangled roots of food can feel really impossible to unravel, and doing the right thing all the time, whatever that might mean to you, is really overwhelming. So it's admittedly much easier to erect this wall of cognitive dissonance by rejecting food as a serious political instrument and instead kind of leaning into this pleasantry of food bringing us together. But I think it's fairly obvious that little progress can come about from all of us ignoring the Pandora's box that is food. So I hosted this presentation today, hoping that as we build our capacity to critically analyze food, we can also collectively direct its power more intentionally towards positive means. Next slide. So I hope that so far I've achieved my first goal of explaining how exactly food is so politically embedded into our lives. My next goal is to make it more accessible that all of you can notice it and then talk about food showing up in all of these ways in our lives in non-academic settings. I recognize this is an academic setting, but like when you're out with your friends, what are some ways we can integrate this into regular everyday talk and make it interesting and not really dry? So what I'm showing now is this framework I've developed. I'm writing a book about it. It's called the Food Identity Seashell. And I hope it can offer us some shared vocabulary today to describe the multitudes that food contains. So the top of the seashell here captures the interlocking ways that food influences our lives. So food takes the form of objects, for example, the physical items that we're eating, that we interact with via a series of actions. So growing, distributing, eating, even defecating. And that is often guided by underlying ideologies or ideas. So the principles of what is normal, what we should eat, what is healthy, what is right, what is wrong. Food imprints itself across multiple contexts. So it shows up in our physical body, how we react to it, in our mental processing, what we're thinking about it, how we anticipate interacting with it, our relationship to other people, where we belong in society, how we identify in different units, and within the global political structure. Next slide. So that was all quite theoretical and abstract. Thank you all for sticking with me. So I'm going to use some examples to quickly locate food as object, action, and ideology. So the example I mentioned earlier, when the US dumps surpluses of wheat and corn and soy abroad and calls it humanitarian aid, these actual objects, these foods, are not only positioning America as the savior of this needy other people, but they become this political bargaining chip that forces the recipient countries to often open up their markets for American goods and therefore accept the subjugated status in the political exchange. So we can understand here that there are literal food objects involved and there are political actions present. And then there's also on top of that or embedded within that social and economic and political ideas being proliferated in the exchange. Similarly, religion and food have a very close relationship. So eating or not eating particular food objects is often an act that's meant to bring one closer to that religion's version of God. During times like Lent or Ramadan, the purposeful abstention from food and drink connects these natural physical sensations that our body's having, maybe hunger or thirst, with a very specific kind of psychological interpretation, like purification or faithfulness, dedication, internal reflection, that's meant to further gel that person to their, faith community. So not only that, if you don't follow their rules, there can also be consequences. So again, in this kind of context, you can see that food takes the form of objects that you're eating, not eating, actions, when you're eating, what you're eating, what times you're eating, and then ideologies of why you're doing all that as we trace it across the way that we're interacting with it. On that note, I'll share a somewhat funny religious example as well, which is the origin of cornflakes, which are in that last photo looking extremely cool. I don't know how they shot that. I think maybe there's like string that they photoshopped out after. Anyway, you may be familiar with the Kellogg brand. The Kellogg's inventor, one of the Kellogg's, there's two of them, the guy who invented cornflakes, his name was John Harvey Kellogg. And he was an ardent Seventh Day Adventist. And so at the time, he was like on this campaign. He believed that if you ate bland foods were symbolic of purity. And one of his goals for the original cornflake that he invented, which doesn't taste the way it does now, it was not sweet, it was really bland, it was like terrible tasting. But the whole idea is like, if you eat these awful bland cornflakes, it would inhibit bodily desires for masturbation, and then people could be more pure and stick to the faith. All right, next slide. So now that we've established how food imparts meaning onto our worldview, how do we also impart meaning onto food? So remember at the very beginning of this lecture, I gave the example of the Spanish colonizers being afraid to eat native foods because they believed their super masculine beards would fall off. Well, within this narrative is the fundamental worry that masculinity is not some sort of inherent quality you keep, but something that must be maintained through external means. So there is an acceptance built in that masculinity is also superior to femininity. Otherwise, losing aspects of one's masculinity would not be a concern at all. So, for someone who believes in the righteousness of a society where masculinity is prized, masculinity is external to the person, and also benefits enormously from their own masculinity, the idea of a potential beard loss triggers a fear that is a lot more catastrophic for them than, say, a woman in that society or a man in a very different or non patriarchal society. So there's a certain kind of inheld belief that you already carry that you're also imparting onto the foods and the ideas of the food. So simply put, because we have unique backgrounds and life experiences, the influence and impact of food on each of us also vary widely. That's the purpose of the bottom half of the seashell framework. So even when the same foods show up in the same ways in the same context, different people with different experiences, be it your race or ethnicity, your gender, social economic status, disability, orientation, religion, etc. These are not exhaustive. Different people with different experiences will interpret and then respond differently. Next slide. So these differences are often announced when deciding how to care for those in need. Oh, please enjoy this nice photo of this Spanish man with a beard for the last example. But in the US, we have this program called SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that offers food aid for low-income families, but requires extensive means testing and verification, including employer and or landlord confirmation financial aid. How unpleasant it is to get that. So even once you're approved for SNAP, the resulting benefits have a lot of limitations. Ever since the 1970s, recipients have been barred from buying hot or prepared food. Like you can't buy a rotisserie chicken, but you could buy a raw chicken, or a warm soup. So you can buy a cold soup, because the idea is you have to cook it. They are not giving you easy cooked edible food to eat. It must be something that you create yourself, because it supposedly gave SNAP eligible families too much of an advantage over other poor families that were making a little bit too much and could not receive SNAP. So you can probably guess the kinds of differing opinions that lawmakers have had about this policy over the year. So some have condemned wasting money on means testing, which is quite expensive, to determine deservingness among some of the poorest people in America, rather than using that money to simply just expand the number of people covered under SNAP. Others have vehemently supported the lists and lists of excluded foods because otherwise, some people might take advantage of the benefits. So here, our personal relationship to money, such as our social economic status from birth until now, which might have changed, our professional career and current salary, tend to influence how we interpret and relate to the food system. Next slide. So, what I personally find most useful about the seashell framework is that it can generate a whole lot of questions. So, for one last applied example, as I hinted at the beginning, I'll walk through how I've used the seashell in my research on one of Singapore's most significant food institutions. And by that, of course, I am referring to hawkers, my favorite topic. So, as objects, hawker dishes represent so many unique facets of our city state. For example, on the left here, you can see the components of pig organ soup tell a story of Singaporean history with the rise and fall of pig farming. After the 1980s, when pig farms were no longer allowed, some stalls replaced fresh pig blood with tofu, while others added parts like heart and lung to bolster the things in the soup. So today, there are entire generations that were born after the 80s, myself included, that have never tasted what was once considered the standard flavor for pig organ soup. Nor are they accustomed to eating a bowl of pig organ soup with a side of glutinous rice wrapped and cooked in pig intestine, which was once a very common sight and common, that's how you would have your rice with your pig organ soup. So actually, there's only one stall in all of Singapore that still offers this. It's Co Brothers in Tiong Bahru, and they do it purely out of passion because they can't charge very much for this side of rice, even though it's extremely difficult to make. In fact, pig organ soup as a whole is becoming less common as a stall that you might find, especially if you go to some of the newer constructed hawker centers that are like been constructed since 2011, because it's an incredibly laborious dish to make, and Singaporeans are starting to change their dietary preferences. So, in the case of these evolving and sometimes disappearing foods, whose responsibility is it to preserve and retain them? What might be the cost of not doing so? And who determines what information makes it onto the official documents? What if there are some unsavory details about the government that are implicated? Now, thinking about hawking as an action, there have been fierce debates in Parliament on whether the industry should or should not be encouraged by formal government policy, especially as the country began to industrialize and transition its economic focus. So, at one point in the 70s and 80s, hawker licenses were actually only given out under a hardship scheme to those people under over 40 years old that had no other means to make a living. And yet, these days, the government is actually very eager to lure more Singaporeans, especially younger ones, or those under 40, to either become hawkers or take over existing stalls. Unfortunately, most policies rolled out so far have been relatively unsuccessful. So, for example, as of 2024, only 7 new hawkers have participated in something called the Hawker Succession Scheme, which was launched back in 2021 to help veteran hawkers pass down the recipes, skills, and customer base for new hawkers take over. So it's not too difficult of a guess why the hawker trade isn't super popular as an option for young people in Singapore. It's long hours, exhausting physical labor, and very low pay, and not a great, lucrative career path. So on top of that, many hawkers that I've interviewed personally for my research has recounted some of the most demoralizing parts of the job is that after working so hard, wanting to bring good food to the people, feeling incredibly looked down upon for their profession and deemed as uneducated or inferior. And that attitude, of course, didn't come out of nowhere. It was just a few decades ago that hawking was all but publicly declared as a last ditch resort for people here. So, given this disconnect of messaging back then versus what are some of the goals for sustainability of this trade now, what are the changes across individual or social or political contexts that might be able to shift the mindsets of the current and next generation? If it's of official importance to preserve the hawker trade, What type of working conditions or career trajectory or quality of life might encourage more entrants and current schemes are not working? Is it possible to generate more respect and compassion for hawkers through official policy? Those are some of the things that I have asked, and there's been many interesting responses. So, considered together, hawker culture is core to the particular ideology of what it means to be Singaporean. Avi Menon, who is the managing director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has referred to hawker food as a social safety net, and Singapore as one of the few first world cities that offer quality meals at third world prices. Kind of just think about that. So, if part of the Singaporean ideal rests on its residents having access to this kind of food, what responsibility does the government have in sustaining hawkers' ability to provide this social service? Should they be subject to the whims of a private or a financialized market if what they're supposed to be providing, their output, is actually a social safety net? So, case in point, this op ed on the right here ran in the Straight Times late last year. It's titled Hawker Culture Debate. The missing ingredient is our willingness to pay. So, as you can see, the framing of the headline already positions the sustainability of hawkers as a problem arising from the lack of consumer responsibility rather than, say, confusing public policy. This is a not uncommon perspective. I've heard it from a lot of people I've talked to and interviewed. But what happens if hawkers actually raise their prices? Let's say everyone's willing to pay. So hawkers are raising their prices to fully reflect the cost to the point where most Singaporeans could not actually afford to eat there regularly. Would that actually negate the concept of preserving hawker culture, even though the hawker centers and the dishes and the stalls still exist? So I think there's this underlying question here of what makes a hawker center a hawker center. It's this tension I refer to as the dynamic between form versus function. If a hawker center is defined by its form, for example, its aesthetics, how the stalls are set up, the fact that it's not air conditioned, whatever, then one could argue even if every single hawker center in Singapore looked like Lau Pasat, mostly fed tourists, that would be fine. Everything's at least $12. Even if every single stall was a franchise inside that center, every stall is reheating foods that came from a central kitchen, that would still qualify. So, in fact, why would hawker centers need to be government owned at that point? Maybe this is why many new ones are actually privately operated, but that's another can of worms I'm not going to open today, unless someone wants to open it in the Q&A. That's fine. So, usually when I say this, there's like pretty negative reactions, right? Like, oh my God, no, that would be a terrible hawker center. And that's not surprising. Something about what I've described of this like future hawker center where everything's really expensive, there's only tourists there, it just doesn't seem right. And so there's something missing about the purpose of the hawker centers that's like not captured there. So then I think then we go back to what's the function of hawker centers? If the function is to feed Singaporeans good food at low prices, then how is a hawker center evaluated on its ability to do that? Is it when a hawker center is only a hawker center if a certain percentage of the population can afford the average price of the dishes based on their income? Like what metrics are you using? Now it seems like there's these policy implications on how things like rent or raw material costs need to be controlled. If those costs go up, the dish prices must stay low for consumers. So perhaps is it the function of hawker centers to offer entrepreneurial opportunities for Singaporeans so that each center is made up of individual or family run and family owned businesses, not franchises and corporate outlets? That could be another function. Or perhaps, like with most things, is there a little bit of both? The definition of a hawker center hinges on both the form, it should look a certain way, but also a function, it should do certain things for society. So those are just a small sample of questions that I've been personally grappling with in my research and using kind of the seashell to break down and kind of help me refine. So what I hope that framework can make clear is there's not a lot of easy solutions, and that our own identities and experiences are going to impact how we ask the questions and devise potential answers. I'm not going to shy away from the fact that as a researcher, I have my own biases. So when I'm thinking about these questions, when I'm reading this op-ed headline, I'm having a personal reaction. So in the light of increasingly, uncertain geopolitics, especially looking at what's coming out of the US right now, I hope the seashell framework can at least make visible some of the connections between food, people, society, politics, and encourage all of you to see yourselves as an active participant in the change process. It is by understanding how we've learned to see the world around us that we can consciously decide how we're going to build a different future. So next slide. So with that, I'm going to end today with a quote that I think sums up nicely why it's so important for us to pay attention to the politics of food. Food is not just fuel, it's information. It talks to your DNA and tells it what to do. Food can be a weapon of mass destruction or a tool to create peace. Thank you all so much. And next slide is just my information if anyone has questions. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. That was fascinating. Thank you so much.